Can we totally eliminate anybody at this point? No, because we don't know where the little girl is. We don't have her back safe.
I had the chance to visit Shelby, North Carolina not too long ago. And I'll be honest, nothing prepared me for the way that town sits with you after you leave. Shelby doesn't hit you with charm or nostalgia. It isn't warm or welcoming, not in the way people like to imagine these southern little towns. It has a stillness to it, a quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels aware, like it's watching you back. And there's a heaviness there, not dramatic, not loud, but something you feel in your chest, something you don't have words for at first. I remember driving out of town and realizing I felt hollow, like something had been taken from me, or maybe like something in that place refused to let go. Because whatever happened to that little girl, whatever happened to Asha Degree, that energy, her story, her fear, her innocence, it hasn't left. It lingers, it breathes in that town. You feel it in the neighborhoods, in the old roads. You feel it even just by walking into the store and coming across the locals. And her story, it just hasn't left. And you should feel free, but somehow you don't. There's a weight to the air, a weight that locals may be used to, but outsiders notice instantly. We're stepping away from the timeline for a minute and looking at the system behind it, the sheriff's office, the history, the leadership, the culture, and yeah, Sheriff Dan Crawford. If you want to understand why things happen the way they did, you can't skip over him. You just can't. So today we're going there. One of the questions I gotten asked, especially when we talk about cases like Asha Degree, is what's the real difference between city police and the sheriff's department? People hear police, sheriff, deputy, and assume that it's all the same thing, right? And in a lot of ways, the work does overlap, but the structure, who answers to who, what jurisdiction they have, and how they're funded matters more than most people realize. It shapes everything from response times to who takes the lead on a missing child case. So let me break it down and explain it from the inside and the way it plays out in counties across the country, including in Cleveland County. First, think of it like layers. You've got the state. Inside the state, you've got counties. Inside counties, you have cities, and sometimes even tiny townships inside those cities. Each layer has the option to become its own governing body. When a city decides to become its own municipality, they can do one of two things: form their own police department or contract those services from the sheriff's office. A city that forms its own police department hires its own officers, buys its own patrol cars, owns its own buildings, and creates its own policies. Those officers are funded by the taxpayers of that city and typically patrol only inside those city limits. They're still state certified, so they have arrest powers, but their day-to-days focus strictly on the boundaries of that one city. Now, in a place like Cleveland County, the sheriff is often the most visible elected official in the entire local government. Their deputies are out on the road every day, interacting with the public, responding to emergencies, and enforcing the law across the entire county, not just one city or jurisdiction. They have the authority to cross municipal boundaries, investigate crimes, and intervene when public safety is at stake. And because the sheriff is elected, they answer to the voters. not to a city council or town manager. That structure matters more than most people realize. The sheriff's office is responsible for keeping the peace in unincorporated areas that don't fall under a city's police department. In counties like Cleveland, that visibility is part of the culture. People remember who the sheriff is, who works for them, and how they show up during a crisis. Depending on the county, the sheriff may also oversee search and rescue teams, drug interdiction units, tactical response teams, or operations dealing with firearms. We even have like organized crime or even potential terrorism threats. And in rural areas, the sheriff's office may be the first and only agency with the resources to respond to certain emergencies, whether it's a missing person, a wildfire, or a major criminal investigation. The sheriff also covers a few responsibilities that police don't touch, such as the jail, the courthouse, inmate transport, civil processes, and many places, the countywide patrols. And then here's something that most folks just don't know. Inside of a big city, you may still have unincorporated county land, little pockets with a city mailing address, but no city police jurisdiction. And in those areas, the sheriff, not the city police, responds to those calls. So two houses on the same street could be served by two totally different law enforcement agencies, depending on whether that land was ever annexed into the city. They may wear different uniforms, answer to different administrations, and operate under different funding structures. But at the end of the day, they're all responding to the same public, often to the same crisis, and sometimes to the same crime scenes. And so when we look at a case like Asha, where jurisdiction lines do matter, response time matters, who took the call matters, who had authority matters, understanding how these agencies overlap become extremely important. The difference between a city police officer and a sheriff's deputy isn't just a badge design, it's the political structure behind it, the funding, the oversight, and the resources that shape an investigation. So when we're talking today about Cleveland County through the lens of the Asha Degree case or any case involving small town justice, power, and accountability, the sheriff's office plays a central role. Their decisions shape investigations, their priorities shape outcomes, and their relationship within the community. And the politics surrounding that office can determine the direction of a case long before the public ever hears the details. In towns like Shelby, everybody knows everybody. And when it comes to law enforcement, that can either mean protection or silence. If you're part of a family with power, be it social, financial, or political, there's a chance things get handled differently behind closed doors. And if you're not, well, maybe you're on your own. And that's what many believe happened in Aisha's case, that someone knew something, that someone got protected, and that the people who were supposed to push for justice didn't push hard enough. And so here we enter Dan Crawford. The sheriff wields extraordinary power, controlling investigations, public narratives, and community trust. In these small southern counties, that office often determines whose stories are believed, whose aren't, and how justice is defined. Dan Crawford inherited that power in the 1990s, a former State Bureau of Investigation agent with deep roots in law enforcement. He rose from field operations to elected office. But unlike many sheriffs, Crawford's authority came with a state level pedigree and a reputation for managing sensitive cases with political calculation. Before Cleveland County ever voted him in, Crawford had already built a controversial resume. In Union County, a 1993 court transcript revealed that a murder suspect, Willie Thomas Hudson, testified that SBI agent Dan Crawford instructed him to lie to prosecutors, claiming that the DA would believe any story he came up with. Earlier in 1989, he was tied to the White Patriot Party investigation after a triple murder at a Shelby adult bookstore. FBI agent Crawford confirmed the case involved white supremacists but declined to identify them publicly. This pattern of tight narrative control, selective disclosure, and sensitivity to political optics followed him into elected office. By the time he became sheriff, Crawford was practiced at balancing truth against image. In 2000, the man in charge was none other than Dan Crawford, a deeply entrenched political figure whose influence shaped every corner of the county's law enforcement culture. He wasn't just a sheriff, he was a brand. His face, his endorsements, and his accomplishments filled full page ads in the local papers. Attorney generals, lieutenant governors, district attorneys, school officials, they all publicly backed him. The political message was constant. Cleveland County Sheriff's Office is in the best shape ever, crime is down, and Crawford is the most qualified sheriff in North Carolina. Crawford's tenure created an environment where the sheriff's office was treated as competent by default and where questioning the department's decisions wasn't common. When you build your political identity on the claim that everything is running perfectly, there's strong incentive to avoid anything that makes the department look unprepared, overwhelmed, or wrong. And that is the backdrop for the earliest days of Asha's case. Under Crawford's leadership, the initial investigation unfolded inside a department accustomed to protecting its public image. Leads and theories that might have hinted at internal misconduct, community ties, or politically connected families would have been scrutinized differently or maybe even quietly steered away. The sheriff's office was operating likely within a culture that rewarded control, minimal transparency, and maintaining the appearance of certainty. Crawford's political strength meant that outside scrutiny from maybe the FBI, the media, or community was likely limited. Even the editorial from the Robesonian about North Carolina sheriffs highlights how much unchecked power the position carried at the time. Sheriffs did not need professional qualifications, didn't need law enforcement training, and were often part of long-standing good old boy networks that shaped how counties handled investigations, crime, and scandal. Crawford fit that era perfectly. He was respected, politically protected, and operating with enormous discretion. So when people today look at the Asha Degree case and ask, why did the investigation rely so heavily on the runaway narrative so early? Why did some tips get public attention while others didn't? If search dogs even lost Asha Degree scent just 2 houses from her home on February 14, 2000, then obviously the trail did not lead down Highway 18. It ended in her neighborhood, yet the investigation pivoted toward extensive ground searches as if she had continued on foot or fled into the surrounding terrain. And the unresolved question with that is not why she wasn't found further away, but why investigators searched beyond the point where her presence was last known confirmed according to the media. You have to remember who was running the department. Sheriff Crawford's leadership involved maintaining the confidence, controlling the message, and preserving credibility. And that kind of culture can shape an investigation without leaving fingerprints. And that's why Crawford is relevant. The tone he set, the political insulation he enjoyed, and the reputation he needed to protect all influenced how the first days and weeks of Asha's case was handled. Ask anyone who's lived here long enough, and they'll tell you justice in Cleveland County may not always look the same for everyone. There's a history of Black families not necessarily getting the same level of urgency, support, or transparency from local law enforcement. And in Asha's case, the response at first seemed quite strong. You have a ground search, dogs, We have local media attention, but behind the scenes, something else was happening. The community began to whisper, and rumors did begin to swirl. Were people being protected? Was someone too close to the family or the sheriff's department? As Cleveland County Sheriff Dan Crawford, who served from 1994 to 2002, styled himself as a reformer, quote, turning a political office into a professional agency, end quote. But beneath that veneer were deep fractures. Three former deputies ran against him in 1998, citing lack of transparency in minority hiring. Then, in February 2000, Asha Degree disappeared. Crawford's response defined his legacy. The case was labeled a runaway within days, meaning critical details might have been missed. Crawford made conflicting statements about the Degree case. Within 72 hours of her disappearance, he stated that he felt foul play may have been suspected and also that he believed she had planned to run away. Witness statements from motorists who came forward only after the media became the anchor for a narrative that required no culpability with other surrounding friends or familiar faces, no forced entry, and no other internal suspicion. In the earliest phase of the Asha Degree investigation, Cleveland County Sheriff Dan Crawford articulated conclusions that reflected competing investigative frameworks. For example, we've got the comment that he made 72 hours after her disappearance, publicly acknowledging the possibility of that foul play, while also stating that he believes that her departure was voluntary. And in an interview with the Shelby Star, Crawford was quoted as saying, "It's obvious she planned this at least for 2 or 3 days," adding that he believed Asha orchestrated her getaway. Notably, we've also got representatives from the same article from the SBI and the FBI who were assisting the case, but they appeared to adopt a more cautious posture. While they did not necessarily publicly dispute Crawford's statements, they did emphasize that Aisha was not a typical runaway, and they did refrain from endorsing conclusions about her intent, any planning, or motive in the absence of corroborated and evidence, whereas his statements or Crawford's statements relied on inferences drawn from perhaps family provided information and circumstantial factors such as the absence of her book bag and a lack of forced entry. So I think the bottom line that we have here is that the runaway narrative became the organizing framework very quickly, and early assumptions shape search strategy, and search strategy shapes what evidence is prioritized, and prioritized evidence reinforces the original assumption. So, what this tells us is that Crawford was interpreting behavior through a runaway lens very early and then fitting subsequent evidence into that framework. And I think the question that we all have is why? Is it possible that politically it may have been the safest possible version of events? It avoided scandal, preserved church alliances, and maintained a sense of control. Crawford became the public face of reassurance, while key leads may have grown cold. If Asha Degree left on her own, the community could maybe sleep easier. Doors did not need to be locked in fear. Parents did not have to wonder whether someone had slipped into the night and taken a child from her home. A runaway narrative removes the need for a local monster. It tells a town that what happened was indeed tragic, but not threatening, that no one was stalking its streets, no one was watching its children, and no one nearby needed to be feared. The politics around Aisha's disappearance were inseparable from Crawford's career. By 2002, though, his grip on the county was beginning to slip. The March 28, 2002 Kings Mountain Herald articles titled "Sheriff Files Suit Against Williams" seems at first glance like a local political spat, but when you slow down and you look at the details, it reveals something far more significant, something that touches directly on Asha Degree's case. And here's what the article actually tells us. We have the accuser, who is Billy D. Williams, who was a Falston resident and who published a local political newsletter called Cleveland County Concerned Citizens for Good Government. He had a history of filing complaints against public officials, including judges and county leaders. He was not just a random guy. He was someone already involved in local political oversight, often critical, sometimes abrasive, but hardly invisible. In one of his publications, he made several explosive allegations about Sheriff Dan Crawford. Williams accused Crawford of mishandling or manipulating the Asha Degree investigation, planting or staging evidence, hiding Asha Degree's body, which is his most extreme claim, abusing citizens, and he referenced a man named Curtis Foster, pressuring or intimidating the Degree family, forcing the Degree family to remove a Hamrick for Sheriff campaign sign. Now, that last allegation is critical and supported by independent reporting. Williams also claimed that Crawford's actions were politically motivated because Crawford was running for re-election. And at the time, Dan Crawford was the incumbent sheriff. He had spent 22 years with the SBI before becoming sheriff. He was endorsed by the Attorney General and Lieutenant Governor. He was also running for re-election in a heated 2002 primary. And Crawford did something unusual for a sitting sheriff. He filed a defamation lawsuit. His attorney, Rick Deaton, filed the suit in Superior Court seeking to halt Williams' publications. The suit alleged that Williams' accusations were false, defamatory, politically harmful, designed to damage Crawford during his re-election and campaign. And in other words, Crawford believed the allegations were serious enough to threaten his political future, and he responded with the legal equivalent of "shut this down now." And we also have here the Degree family's role and why that even matters. And this is the part almost no one has ever explained properly. The article states in print that the Degree family had a campaign sign for Raymond Hamrick, Crawford's political opponent, in their yard during the 2002 sheriff's primary. So let's think about that. A missing child's parents, whose case depended entirely on the sheriff's office, were displaying a sign supporting the sheriff's opponent. And that's not normal. And why is this important? It's because families of missing children almost never take political stances involving the person leading their case. Doing so risks alienating the very investigator with the power to help them. It also raises questions. Did the Degrees lose confidence in Crawford? Were they encouraged to support Hamrick by someone they trusted? Were they expressing frustration with how Asha's case was handled? Or were they pressured either socially, politically, or even religiously? I mean, we don't know their motive, but the fact itself is remarkable. The article suggests that Crawford believed the sign could make him look bad during the election, especially if people thought the Degrees preferred Hamrick. And according to Williams, Crawford pressured the family to remove the sign. This allegation is what triggered part of the lawsuit. And the question that kind of pivots us as to why Crawford sued and what the real motive behind that was. And Crawford didn't sue to defend the integrity of the Asha Degree investigation. He sued because he believed the accusations were destroying his reputation. He believed Williams' claims could cost him re-election. He believed the allegations about the Degree family sign were politically damaging, and he wanted a court order to stop the publication immediately. It's not a small dispute. This was a sheriff in the middle of an election taking a civilian to court over what he viewed as a targeted political attack involving a missing child case. And it happened while Asha was still missing. And so, what does all this mean for Asha's case? Here's the part listeners have not been told. This article reveals that Asha's disappearance was being pulled into local politics. A missing child case becoming part of a sheriff's election is pretty rare. A family displaying the opponent's sign is even rarer. A sheriff suing someone over claims about the family is almost unheard of. And together, these details show Asha's case had become politically sensitive. The sheriff believed any appearance of mishandling the case would cost him power. The Degree family's political actions were noticed and responded to. The investigation existed inside a climate of distrust, pressure, and reputation management. This means the case was not only a search for a missing child, but also a political hazard, a public relations vulnerability, and a point of leverage in a campaign. And when politics enters an investigation, truth becomes secondary to control. And that's why this article matters so much here. It gives us a rare glimpse into the environment surrounding the case, the relationships, the tensions, the motives, and the fear. And it explains the one question no one ever asked. Why was the Degree family involved in sheriff's politics at all? And what did that mean for the investigation into their daughter's disappearance? Crawford's office operated in a world where protecting reputations outweighed transparency. He lost his re-election bid that year, and with it, controls of the narrative he had spent years maintaining. After Crawford lost re-election, Hamrick inherited a cold case that had already been shaped and limited by decisions made during Crawford's tenure. Raymond Hamrick is a comparatively quiet figure in the Asha Degree case. Unlike Sheriff Dan Crawford, who was highly visible and vocal in shaping early public narratives, Hamrick's role appears limited and a bit reactive rather than directive. By the time Hamrick became sheriff, the foundational framework of the cases was already in place. His documented involvement included responding to a tip years later that led investigators to dig for bones believed to be connected to Asha Degree. That search ultimately concluded the remains were likely animal, and Hamrick made no effort to reposition the investigation or publicly revisit earlier assumptions. His actions suggest more of a caretaker role rather than one of aggressive leadership. And what makes Hamrick notable is not what he did during the Asha Degree investigation, but what he did at the very end of his tenure. In November 2010, after losing re-election, Hamrick fired Sheriff-elect Alan Norman and members of Norman's transition team just days before Norman was set to take office. The stated reason involved current Sheriff Alan Norman's misuse of department vehicles, but the timing is impossible to ignore. This termination disrupted the transition, severed access to departmental resources, and reinforced who still controlled the institution until the final moment. It also signaled how tightly authority, loyalty, and narrative control were held within the department. This shows us a department where power was centralized, transitions were contentious, and institutional continuity was not guaranteed. It explains why long-standing assumptions could persist unchallenged and why changing course later would be difficult even for a new sheriff. Raymond Hamrick's 2004 search effort wasn't particularly groundbreaking because he wasn't working with a fresh investigation. He was following a trail that had already gone cold under a sheriff whose office wasn't necessarily accustomed to outside pressure or deep self-examination. It reminds us that investigations do not exist in a vacuum. They exist inside organizations, personalities, and political realities that shape what gets questioned, what gets preserved, and what quietly remains untouched. In other words, Crawford's relevance isn't in what he did, it's in the environment that he helped to shape. An environment where a case like Asha Degree's could slip into ambiguity, uncertainty, and silence. In a 1992 coverage of multiple homicide investigations involving Black women who were last seen walking along rural roads or highways in North Carolina, then FBI agent Dan Crawford was quoted emphasizing that prostitution and drug use placed those victims in very vulnerable positions. The danger in his telling flowed from lifestyle and circumstance rather than from a specific external threat. That same framework quietly seems to reappear in the Asha Degree case. Within days of her disappearance, Crawford advances the idea that Asha had planned her departure for days and left on her own. Later sightings of a young woman or little woman walking along Highway 18 became central to the narrative, despite the improbability of a 9-year-old child willingly navigating a dark, stormy, rural highway in the early morning hours. The image of Asha as a lone walker in the night served a function. It shifts focus away from enclosed spaces, familiar people, and controlled environments, and places danger out on the road. This framing is not necessarily unique to Asha, because when you look at Asha Degree's disappearance in 2000 and compare it to the case of Iris Dee Dee Dawkins, who died under suspicious circumstances and whose body was found in Brookford, North Carolina in 1992, a pattern begins to emerge. Cases involving children of color or politically inconvenient truths often stall at the intersection of law enforcement discretion and local politics. The same dynamics that shaped Crawford's response to Asha's case, narrative control, selective accountability, and political image, can be seen again in the aftermath of Dawkins' death. Despite some community suspicion, her killer has never been brought to justice, and the investigation languished amid jurisdictional deflection and political silence. In October 2024, Brookford Police Chief William Armstrong, who is Black, became the center of his own controversy when he turned himself into authorities after a Catawba County grand jury indicted him on charges of altering, destroying, or stealing criminal evidence and willful failure to discharge his duties in connection with the decades-old 1992 Dee Dee Dawkins cold case. Prosecutors allege Armstrong improperly handled or failed to preserve an audio recording from an interview with a person of interest in the case who has also since died, including claims he left his phone or recordings unsecured in that person's home. Armstrong pleaded not guilty and fought to have the charges dismissed, arguing they were politically motivated, in part because he had announced a bid for Catawba County Sheriff. However, a judge has since refused to throw the case out, and it remains active as it moves toward trial, likely in 2026. In a twist, Armstrong has highlighted that an Asha Degree billboard once appeared in Brookford, years before Dee Dee Dawkins was ever publicly recognized there with her own billboard, despite Dee Dee's body having been found in that same town several years earlier. And in true Brookford fashion, just when you think the story couldn't get any stranger, the Brookford Police Department recently announced a partnership with ICE. But that, as they say, is a topic for another day. Armstrong's downfall wasn't just personal, it appeared to be systemic. His case illuminated how deep relationships between sheriff's office, police departments, and district attorneys can blur the lines between justice and self-preservation. And in each of these cases, you might see a similar playbook. You have minimizing controversy, protect allies, preserve the illusion of control, keep the public narrative tightly managed, and an impending political campaign. Her case, like Asha's, unfolded in a similar system where officials moved quickly to reassure the public, narrow the scope of fear, and signal that there was no roaming threat that required broader scrutiny. The recurring emphasis on victims being out walking, whether they were a child or they're adult women, is not incidental, or so it appears. It creates psychological distance. If the danger happens on the highway, it does not live next door. If the risk arises from personal behavior, the community remains safe. Doors need not be locked. Trust in local order remains intact. What happened to Asha Degree, Dee Dee Dawkins, and others across Cleveland and Catawba counties reflects a broader truth about power in the rural South. Justice isn't always about evidence, it's also about politics, proximity, and protection. Crawford's story is not just a historical footnote, it's a window into how institutional power, race, and politics shape small town justice. After leaving office, Crawford slowly faded from public view. In 2015, he died by suicide, a haunting end for a man whose entire career was built on power and survival. He wasn't just a sheriff, he was the gatekeeper of what the public was allowed to believe. His runaway narrative absolved institutions, deflected scrutiny, and aligned with voters' comfort zones. And yet, under his watch, one of the most significant child disappearances in North Carolina's history remains unsolved. So why go back to this? Why dredge up nearly 26-year-old politics? Because Asia still hasn't been found, because people are still holding on to secrets, and because what happened or didn't happen inside the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office in 2000 still matters. It matters because someone out there knows what happened and was given the luxury of silence. And it matters because there are still families like Asia's waiting for answers in a system that was never really built for them to begin with. When you ask people in Shelby about Asha Degree, you'll notice the tone changes. It's cautious, almost rehearsed. They'll tell you what they've always said. They'll say, she ran away after that basketball game. That's the script. That appears to be the safe version, but here's the thing, people don't protect a story that doesn't protect them. For nearly 26 years, that version of events that Asha packed her things and left on her own has served as a kind of shield. It protects the idea that what happened to her was random, unpredictable, and not anyone's fault. Because if that story cracks, the questions that follow may be uncomfortable. Who really knew what was going on in that neighborhood back then? Who saw something but didn't want to get involved? Who was connected to someone they couldn't afford to cross? Why eyewitnesses were allowed to give unbelievable, inconsistent statements to the media? Or maybe how certain names keep coming up, people tied to local families, care homes, or the sheriff's own political circle, and still no arrest. You see, silence in a small town isn't always about fear. Sometimes it's about loyalty. Sometimes it's about survival. And sometimes it's about the quiet deals that hold everything together. Families, churches, law enforcement, politics, all woven so tightly that pulling one thread could unravel the entire thing. Almost 26 years later, and the case is still being talked about. Podcasts, online forums, media coverage, Reddit, and suddenly people who stayed quiet back then are resurfacing. They're appearing in comment sections on Facebook threads or whispering names that used to be off limits. Maybe it's guilt, or maybe it's time. Or maybe it's because something is shifting and some people can feel the truth starting to rise. And it's not just about Asha anymore. It all ties back to the same question. What happens when the story that kept everyone safe no longer works? Here, truth isn't just about justice, it's about power, and power always protects itself. So when people tell me Asha ran away, I don't just hear a theory, I hear nearly 26 years of protection of names, protection of reputations, protections of a town that didn't want to look too closely at itself. But maybe now it doesn't get that choice anymore.
And even though these new discoveries now point to an abduction or possibly a murder,
We're going to do everything we can to try to be able to sit down with them at some point in time and be able to tell them where their daughter is, what condition she was in when she was found, and what the circumstances are and were around her death, if that be the case.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Cleveland County Valentine. If you haven't already, please like and follow us on Facebook or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I would also like to encourage anyone who knows anything at all about Asha's disappearance to come forward and share what you know. I want this podcast to be an outlet for people surrounding this case. Have yourself a great rest of the week and join us next time for a new episode of Cleveland County Valentine.